Rowan Dean and Ross Cameron. As many of you know, I'm the editor of The Spectator magazine, and one of the joys of being the editor of that magazine is you get to read the most extraordinary articles before everyone else does. I was thrilled this week by an article which we made our front cover this week, which we'll show you, by David Adler, where he asks, is our foreign aid actually being used to incite hatred, violence, and even murder against Jews in Israel via the Palestinian authorities and the United Nations? It's a huge story, incredibly important. Every Australian taxpayer would be horrified if they thought that this were the case. So we're going to go straight to our guest today, David Adler. Welcome to Outsiders.
Delighted to be here.
It's a big claim. Now talk us through it. Tell us exactly what you're talking about.
Well, we have a two-tier problem. The first is that we know that the Palestinian Authority reward terrorism. They have a pay scale. They've published it. The bigger the jail sentence, the more money. And if the terrorist is killed, there is a Palestinian Authority's Martyrs Fund. In 2017, it's $350 million US. And they announced a couple of weeks ago they were increasing it to $403 million US.
The Martyrs Fund.
Yeah.
And the Martyrs Fund is used how?
It's used to provide a salary, a notional salary, if a terrorist is caught and jailed. And if the terrorist is killed, either executing the event or subsequently by authorities, then the family get a lifetime pension. So it's got that two arms to it.
So when we talk about terrorists, let's be clear, we're talking about Palestinians from either Gaza or the West Bank,
Yep.
murdering Israeli citizens.
Or
Attempting to,
yeah,
or
exactly, or
cars mowing down,
all those things, from suicide bombings to car rammings to even stone throwing can be very dangerous and has killed people as well. So all those things, stabbings, there's the so-called stabbing intifada, all those things.
What a charming moment in the history of human civilizations, a stabbing intifada. Yes, man.
So talk us through this, because we're going to go to a clip in a second of a
Right.
guy at the UN whose family were the result of this process. So talk us through exactly how it works with the Palestinian Authority. How do they reward these people?
Well, as I said, they have a scale. The other dimension worth adding, and it's only happened in the last couple of days, and the article you referred to alludes to the US Taylor Force Act, which was named after a young American recently killed by a Palestinian terrorist. That has just passed Congress last week. So there is now a law in the US to withhold certain grants until the Palestinian Authority stops paying terrorists. Australia hasn't yet gone down that track. We provide the Palestinian territories, according to the DFAT website, with $43.8 million in the current financial year, and who knows how much in the next budget. So
we give the Palestinian territories 43 million. Australian taxpayers give 43 million to them.
Correct.
Who does that money literally go to?
Well, it's very hard to trace, but it undoubtedly some of it gets siphoned to the Palestinian Authority, and I have little doubt, and the people that have looked at it have no doubt, that some Australian dollars ends up in the pool that rewards terrorists.
Okay, but I'll pick you up on that, because Julie Bishop and DFAT, you've approached them with this, and they've said no, we're not interested in the evidence, and you'll get onto the evidence in a second, but they've said they're not interested, that they're satisfied that the money isn't going from the Palestinian Authority to this process of rewarding terrorists.
I know there's been a specific approach on the second issue that the article addresses, which is the funding of the UNRWA schools.
Yes, talk us through UNRWA and the UNRWA schools.
UNRWA is a special agency just to look after the
United Nations
Relief and Works Agency.
Right.
And it runs a number of schools in Gaza and the West Bank. And if you have a look at the school books, the material in it, there is all sorts of material which denies the existence of Israel, which is frankly anti-Semitic, which is political activism, and which incites terrorism. Numerous examples.
I'm just going to look at one of those examples now. Now, this is actually not UNRWA, but it is a school in Gaza.
Correct.
We're going to
An UNRWA school.
An UNRWA school. Okay, so this is a United Nations-sponsored school in Gaza. And let's have a look at a school play where you will see these are Palestinian kids in Gaza. Let's have a look at, let's roll the tape. You will see some kids dressed up as Jews, and you'll see some kids dressed as Jews who are being killed by the other Palestinian kids. It's horrific.
Well, the pictures speak for themselves. We understand that in the middle of last year, a group of Israeli academics did go do a forensic study on the text on, I think, 127 different textbooks in the Palestinian state. They have produced a report.
Correct.
Tell us what the report found.
Well, the agency or the institute that did that study is the Centre for Near East Policy Research in Jerusalem, headed by a remarkable, energetic man called David Adler.
How do you spell Badin if people are looking for it?
B-E-D-E-I-N.
Yes.
And he had a couple of people on his team that had PhDs in Arabic that were experts, and they gathered up all the school books and they translated them, and they produced a report which has been presented to the Secretary-General of the United Nations, was presented in conjunction with the prestigious Simon Wiesenthal Centre in America to some members of US Congress, and we're very confident that that is one of the factors that has caused the Trump administration to cut down on funding of UNRWA.
Look, we have a second piece of tape that we are going to show people just for the completeness of the story, so it doesn't seem like an academic question, this one of actually rewarding violence against Jews. This is a speech to the UN.
The UN?
This is the UN Human Rights Council speech just last week.
From just last week. Okay, let's have a look. It speaks for itself.
My father, Richard Lakin, was brutally murdered by Palestinian terrorists at the age of 76, shot in the head and butchered with a knife after he fell to the ground. President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority rewarded his killers and their families with $3 million. That's right, $3 million. The Palestinian Authority actually has a pay-to-slay law. Palestinians systematically pay terrorists to kill Jews. More than $300 million a year.
So, David, so it would appear that Trump is satisfied that there is a link between funding for UNRWA, funding to the Palestinian territories, foreign aid. So he and the American administration have gone, okay, they've made it a specific, they've linked it now. They've said, unless you stop the incitement to violence within your schools and within your culture, unless you stop that, we're stopping the funding.
Exactly.
Now, that's the link that Trump has seen. Can Australia make that same link? And why won't Australia make that same link? What's the block?
Well, at this stage, I know that a few MPs have raised the question in correspondence with the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, and advice has been sought from DFAT. But the only thing DFAT has done, as far as we can determine, is that they've written to UNRWA and said, is there a problem? And UNRWA writes back and says, if there was a problem, we've fixed it. And that was the response. We really need to shine a spotlight on this. And the evidence is overwhelming. The report that Ross has in front of him is 2017. There's been another one done.
So what's in the report?
That's the
Many
127 different textbooks inside.
Yeah.
Particularly, you get this issue where you'll have geography being taught in which there is a map of Palestine, which Israel doesn't exist.
Exactly.
And, Andrew Breitbart said that politics is downstream from culture. And he was really saying that the political decisions that are finally made in the Knesset or in the Palestinian Authority or in the Australian Federal Parliament do not come out of a vacuum, but they are the result of decisions that were made, micro-decisions in the arts, in our university sector, but most especially in our classrooms, years, indeed, decades before. And if we tolerate at that level, we should not be surprised when you wind up at the bureaucratic level today, this complete inability of anyone in a federal Liberal coalition to take responsibility for the fact that almost certainly Australian tax dollars have been used to pay people to kill Jews.
100%. And the US response, the Trump administration response, has been, in fact, to implement a two-tier strategy. They've now got the Taylor Force Act, which deals with the payment for terrorism, the sort of pay-for-slay program, and they're clamping down on UNRWA, which is the factory which produces future terrorists, if you like. Australia puts money into both, not as much as the US. We put about $17.6 million into UNRWA in the current financial year, and we think the same strategy needs to be seriously looked at for Australia.
And you mentioned one of the things you mentioned as well, Ross, the geography class. The one which I couldn't believe in your article, David, was the maths class, where they sit around and do maths with how many dead martyrs there are and adding up using the number of dead Jews as a kind of maths exercise. I mean, this is beyond fascism. It's the worst of totalitarian thinking, and yet we are potentially financing this.
There's another example which I think would shock your audience, and that is there was an event where Molotov cocktails were thrown into a bus, an ordinary bus, and in a textbook, an unrefunded textbook, that is described as a barbecue party.
Oh, Jesus.
See, one of the questions we make go, we can feel, we can see it and have an emotional reaction in the moment to it. Okay, the question of principle it raises is, do the Palestinians actually have any interest in peace? Does the Palestinian leadership...
Well, show us your scarf there. I think that answers the question, Ross.
The sort of cultural message that you were alluding to goes from the lowest level of, kindergartens and junior schools right to their highest leaders. When I was in Israel last year, a good friend of mine, Professor Mordechai Kadar, gave me a souvenir of a genuine PLO leader's scarf.
Just hold it up so the camera...
I will. It has two illustrations on it. One is the Dome of the Rock, and it tells me in Arabic this is translated as Jerusalem is ours. Now, in its 3,000-year history, Jerusalem has never been the capital of an Arab or Muslim entity. It's been conquered many times, but it's never been made the capital of anything other than a Jewish state. But that's their message, Jerusalem is ours. And on the other side is indeed the map that you were referring to. In Arabic, this says Philistina, and it shows the entire area, no Israel. So from the kindergarten, now we're not funding the scarves as far as I know.
Yeah. Well, certainly, David, when I was in Israel, we went to Ramallah, we visited the PLO. I told this story before, but 8 Australian journalists sat there with the PLO spokesperson, and we asked him what the two-state solution would look like, and his answer was unequivocal. He did not hesitate. He said the first state was Palestine, and when we asked the question how many Jews were in it, he said none whatsoever. I said, that's fine, what's the second state? He said, you can call it whatever you want. We said, can we call it Israel? He said, if you want. And we said, how many Jews in Israel? and he mumbled with his associates and his advisors, and they faffed around for about a couple of minutes, and then they said, maybe a handful. So that's the PLO. That was, I have 8 witnesses to that conversation, Australian journalists, 1, 2 from this station, who the PLO's attitude is they're going to butcher all the Jews. They're just going to butcher them and get rid of them. We've seen the play there with the kids with the guns and all that. That's their clear intention. We had a guest a couple of weeks ago on Outsiders, Daniel Pipes, who had an article yesterday, which you're probably referring to, Ross, in the Australian, where he talks about the strategy of Israel victory. Basically, the Palestinian, Israel has to take a stronger position and say, actually, no, we have won, we are going to impose peace settlement, not sit around and this ridiculous game that's gone on since Camp David of trying to pretend the person who wants to kill you and destroy you, that you're somehow equal partners. What are your thoughts, David?
Ross, there's a wonderful Arabic saying.
Rowan, he's Ross. I know
A lot of people get that.
That's what your person in Melbourne, they thought you were. I was so excited.
There's a wonderful, you'd be surprised that I might quote an Arabic saying, but in English it is, how long will you drag a dead camel before you realise it is dead? Now, the so-called two-state model, which no one can label a solution, has been dragged for 25 years now. Various offers have been made, completely unsuccessful. There is a whole group of people in the conservative side of Israeli politics, academics, commentators, who are now thinking outside the square and are coming up with different models. In May, we are bringing one of those leaders to Australia, a man by the name of Yishai Fleischer, and maybe you'll have...
Maybe we'll have him on. It depends.
Well, I just want to put this proposition to the Green Trade Union Industrial Bob Carr Sellout Israel Brigade. No doubt, Jacqueline Maley will say that the interests of Jews we should hit the mute button.
Alt-right,
for some reason, their Jewish privilege means they should be subject to a stabbing intifada. I'm sorry, I withdraw that. I just say that the mainstream, the ABC, is absolutely hostile to Israel. And when Fran Kelly brings back, as Gerard Henderson, an avid viewer of the show, has pointed out, and when the ABC's Middle East correspondent comes back and Fran Kelly says, you're amazing, she says, well, I rely on independent sources, and then she goes through and lists a number of sort of George Soros, borderless world NGOs who are the most biased, unreliable, one-eyed, bigoted, anti-Jew sources in the world. But I just want to point out to those who are watching this question that the Palestinian Authority, as Rowan points out from that conversation, is proposing a racial state. The state that they are explicitly asking for is a state free of Jews. And that will make them, we are apparently all sitting around endorsing this. I mean, in Johannesburg, we've got ANC leaders saying, well, we're going to murder the whites, but we haven't quite got around to it. But the Palestinians have been saying for 25 years, oh yeah, we want a racial state.
Yes, and
we want a state with no Jews. You've got plenty of Palestinians in Israel today. You've got plenty of Arabs in Israel today. You've got plenty of Muslims in Israel today. And the Israeli leadership, the Dome of the Rock, it's shared space, right? But the Palestinians are saying, no, we're not sharing with the Jews. So I just say, to the left, are you on the side of the Enlightenment, or do you want to create new racial states?
Ross, David, I'm just going to quickly ask you the name of your organisation, and just quickly, what would you like to see happen? What should the Australian government be doing to resolve this issue?
The organisation is Australian Jewish Association, and people can look at a Facebook page by that name, or put
that up on the screen for you.
To Google, and they'll find a website. The Australian government needs to consider, I mean, this is so obvious. If the Australian people knew that foreign aid could be diverted for terrorism, they'd be outraged, and I hope you'll get a reaction to the clips you've shown. There's also a very important moral question for Australia. Last year, Israeli intelligence helped prevent terrorism here, an aircraft incident potentially. And yet we are providing money which encourages terrorism in Israel. I mean, is that a problem?
You're absolutely right. And that terrorist incident, which the Israeli intelligence helped prevent, would have been a horrific incident in Sydney with the plane going down. David Adler, thank you so much for joining us on Outsiders today. Fascinating stuff. Let's hope the government